Hey, welcome back to the New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for tonight, February 22nd, 2024. Tonight we're going to have author James Forr. James contributed to the team that time won't forget. He'll be talking about Al Corwin. He also, a lot of you might know James. He's in the midst of his Candlestick Park retrospective that he asked a lot of our members if they have any reflections on him. So he's going to probably first talk about that book and where it stands and the like. So we will get to James in a second. Next week we will have Lou Friedman. Lou just wrote a brand new book, Tales from the Clubhouse: Great Baseball Moments Remembered. And of course, it'll be talking mostly about the Giants and other fabulous events in the game's history. Couple of other things. I was on a Zoom on Sunday, the Saber Landmarks Committee. It is a committee that finds landmarks. They put them on maps. They put grave sites on maps. And I joined that committee a couple of years ago. I went to a Zoom on Sunday, and I showed them pictures of the Polo Grounds, the signage there, and they were very intrigued about the possibility of restoring those items. We shall see. Somebody also in the group said there is a Polo Grounds seat roughly for $1,500 that one of them owns. If anybody's interested, you guys can email me, and I'll see what I can do for you as far as, I guess, brokering the deal. I'm not getting any money. I don't mean it in that type, but just getting you to the right guy. Also, I'm sorry?
There were a number of seats that were auctioned about 5 years ago at the Sotheby Park Manette, and they went for less than that for sure. But they had
I'm just the middle guy here, just telling you what I was told. I'm still waiting word on the Mays checks. So whoever did donate, hopefully within the next few days, you'll see a canceled check.
Yeah, I hope so.
They were mailed out and they were received at the post office in San Francisco on Saturday. And somebody from there, I believe Renee, Willie's assistant, would have to go down and pick them up. So that's all I have with that. So
congratulations again on that. That was a wonderful.
Whoever contributed should be congratulated. It was a nice thing that we did. So also there's somebody on Facebook from Connecticut who has some giant programs from way back when. It's looking to, I assume, sell them, but to people in Connecticut. So if anybody's interested, again, you can get in touch with me. With that all being said, I would like to introduce James Forr. Again, this great book that Saber produced. James contributed about Al Corwin, starting pitcher for the Giants. And James is going to discuss him. But first, I think he wants to talk a little bit about his new project. And we'll turn the floor over to James. James, welcome to the New York Giants Preservation Society.
All right. Thank you, Gary. All right. Thanks, Gary. And thanks, everybody, for the invitation. Am I able to share a screen? I have some slides that
Absolutely.
If I can show, I'll show them.
We love slides.
All right.
Hold on a second. No, that's not it. This should be it. All yours, James.
All right. Give me one moment to get this pulled up on the screen.
Good one.
Are you able to see that okay?
Looks
Yes,
great.
beautiful.
All right, excellent. So I'll talk, as Gary said, for a few minutes about the Candlestick Park book that is in progress, and then we'll discuss Al Corwin from the 1954 and 1951 New York Giants. So this book on Candlestick is an edited volume. A number of you have made contributions to it. Charles, Bill, Ken, Dan Vandemortel have all contributed in some way. Gary, you've contributed indirectly by helping me make some connections. Candlestick, of course, was the home of the Giants from 1960 through 99, and then the 49ers were there up until 2013. And we have a number of chapters in the book, or will have a number of chapters in the book, starting with way back before the Giants, going back to the history of baseball in San Francisco, from the Seals and the PCL, and even going all the way back to the Gold Rush. We'll talk a little bit about the relocation from New York to San Francisco. And then the fun kind of starts as we get into the construction of the park, which, like a lot of things associated with Candlestick, was kind of a mess. There were legal hassles and delays and oversights and cost overruns. Here you see Mayor Christopher on the left side, sort of in the early stages of that process. The park ended up opening a year late because of all those hassles. So that's an interesting part of Candlestick's history. But once it opened, at least at first, it was a really pretty stadium, especially before they enclosed it. So we have a lot of first-person memories from folks who were there, not only about what it was like in those early days, but also what it was like a little bit later. We have recaps of two of the great seasons from when the Giants were in Candlestick, 1962 and 1989. But we also talk about some of the pratfalls that were part of Candlestick, including most prominently the weather. And a number of people had memories of, they could remember scenes like this, looking out at the outfield fence, and there's newspapers and programs and all kind of stuff that the wind had blown out there and stuck to the fence. We have chapters talking about not only why the weather was so bad there from a meteorological standpoint, but also a chapter on how the weather affected the way the game that was played. Dan has contributed a chapter about the infamous radiant heating system that never quite worked right, that was supposed to be placed underneath the box seats and were supposed to keep everybody warm, but it never quite worked. And it got the Giants sued by Melvin Belli, a very famous attorney who later defended Jack Ruby. And he, of course, had a flair for the dramatics. So he showed up in the courtroom looking like this in this Alaskan parka that he wore that helped him in part get a small judgment.
Good stuff.
Against the Giants. So that's a funny, really funny and entertaining chapter that Dan put together. The Giants drew actually reasonably well in Candlestick until the A's moved to Oakland in 1968, and then the attendance kind of went down considerably. But the team was pretty competitive into the early 70s. But then once the mid 70s hit, the team really kind of went into the tank, and so did the attendance. And it became almost untenable. So we'll talk about efforts there were all sorts of harebrained ideas about how to make the weather less of a factor. We'll talk about the myriad efforts to put a dome on the park, the myriad efforts to build a new park, and the near moves. There were near moves of the team, one in 1976 when they nearly relocated to Toronto. Another move in 1992 where they were almost certainly going to go to Tampa, but Peter McGowan ended up coming in there and saving things at the last minute. There were rumored moves to New Orleans, rumored moves to San Jose. Donald Trump once in the early 80s was in serious discussions about buying the team. So we'll cover all of that stuff. We also have some of the really lighthearted stuff because with all that quirkiness, there was just like weird stuff that happened at Candlestick. It was a really challenging place for security, in part because, as you might remember, there was this gap between the outfield fence and the stands. And whenever a home run would be hit, you'd see scenes like this where people would congregate and just pile on and try for that home run ball. And it was actually like people got hurt. It was like a pretty serious security incident. So we talk about the security a little bit. George Costa is with the Giants now, is in charge of security. So he'll talk about some of the things that they've experienced and some of the things they did over the years to mitigate that problem. We talked to a guy named George Poley, who is a member of the San Francisco Police Department, who was detailed at Candlestick, and he has some funny stories about fans going crazy on Tom Lasorda and having to restrain people from jumping on the field when it got late at night and everybody was drunk. On the other side of that, we talked to sort of like the opposite side of the police. One person who was a young man, he told all the stories about how you could sneak into the stadium without anybody noticing you and go up to the top row of the bleachers and smoke weed and do whatever else that you wanted to do. So it's sort of an interesting perspective on the security of the place. And also just the things that they did to keep people in there. We had a Q&A also with Pat Gallagher, who was the head of marketing for the team for many, many years. And he said their attendance, their attitude starting in the late 70s and through much of the 80s was, look, the team is terrible. The park is terrible, but let's at least have fun when we're there. So he developed ideas like the quad candlestick, which was awarded to fans who stayed there at night through really cold games. They had the crazy crab mascot, which I'm sure you read about. One time between games of a doubleheader, it was a doubleheader between the Mets and the Giants in the mid 70s. And he's, you know, as Pat said, in the mid 70s, the only worst thing than a Mets Giants game was 2 Mets Giants games. So they hired Carl Wallenda to come and do a high wire walk at Candlestick with wind blowing all over the place. So Pat had some interesting stories about that. It's a really funny Q&A. And then we also cover some of the key games that were played there, from the 1961 All-Star game where Stu Miller was quote unquote blown off the mound. Game 7 of the 1962 World Series, the Marichal Roseboro game, and of course, Game 3 of the '89 World Series when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. So we have a story about that game, and also some first-person accounts from people who were there. One guy, Henry Lenz, was the radio engineer for CBS Radio, and he talks very dramatically about the chaos that ensued and everything they had to do to keep the radio broadcast on the air. And just Jack Buck and Johnny Bench filling time for an hour and a half as news about what happened sort of trickled in. There was a structural engineer who just by total coincidence happened to be there at the time. And he talked about his analysis that, like, if that earthquake had been centered much closer, or if it had lasted much longer, it could have been a real major catastrophe at the park. And we also talked to a member of the California Highway Patrol, Cliff Gray, who was there and then returned 10 days later to throw out the first pitch. If you're a Niners fan, there's a little bit in there for you too. We talk about the history of football at Candlestick from the Oakland Raiders, who actually played there for a season and a half before the Coliseum was built. We talk a lot about turf, which the 49ers were basically installed for the 49ers. But also caused a lot of problems for the 49er players. And there was a whole political drama about the artificial turf that was put in there as well.
Be fine.
And we talk about, we'll have chapters on some of the more offbeat events that occurred there. So the Pope's visit in 1987, we have a chapter on that goes into a lot of detail about the planning for that event. The Beatles played their last official concert there in 1965. There was a short time when it served as a boxing venue for a championship match. And there were TV shows and movies that were filmed there. Dan wrote a chapter about a movie called Experiment in Terror, a classic movie that where Candlestick played a really prominent role. All the way up to the end. We talk about the demolition of the park and also kind of what's going on there now, which at the moment isn't a whole lot because the redevelopment of the Candlestick area has been tied up in legal drama. But there are all sorts of Q&As too. We talked to Sherry Davis, the first female PA announcer in the major leagues, Bruce Jenkins, who was a sports writer, Patrick Schneider is one of the clubhouse assistants. And we got some memories from some players too, Will Clark, Jim Barr, Terry Kennedy, John Burkett, among others, Ed Montague, whose dad was a scout for the Giants, and he was later a longtime umpire. He shares his thoughts as well. So this book will be published by McFarland Publishing. It's the latest in their historic ballpark series. The goal is to get my goal is to get a finished manuscript to them, hopefully by the end of the year. And then I hope to see this book by the end of 2025 or early 2026, although your mileage may vary on that deadline. So thank you to everyone who contributed and has helped me out with this book. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to getting it put together.
James, we all need to be around for your presentation when the book comes out. Why don't we do this? Why don't you talk about Al Corwin, and then questions could be asked about some of your presentation about the upcoming book, but more importantly about Al Corwin.
Absolutely. Happy to talk about Al Corwin. So Al Corwin, whose real name was Elmer Nathan Corwin, he was born in December 1926 in Newburgh, New York, which is a town, it's about 60 miles up the Hudson River from New York City. And he came from a long line of entrepreneurs, which something that will probably resurface here later in my presentation about him. So his grandfather was a businessman who ran a grocery store. His dad owned and operated a bus line that was based in a nearby town. And later on, his dad owned a silk mill and a small hotel, and he was involved in all kinds of fraternal organizations. So Al's dad was a pretty prominent guy in the Newburgh, New York area. His parents divorced when he was 10, which of course was relatively rare in those days. But when I did this research on him back in 2013, I had a chance to speak with his sister, Harriet Conklin. And she said the divorce didn't really have a major traumatic impact on her or Al. There were a lot of aunts and uncles in the area, so they still had lots of emotional support. Al Corwin he was a tremendous athlete. He played 4 sports in high school, and he was one of those really annoying people that you come across in life who's good at everything. So he was a great athlete. His sister said he was a brilliant speed skater. He won a marbles championship at one time. So he was a really accomplished, skilled guy and a very intelligent guy as well. Toward the end of the war, in 1944, he was 18 years old. He went right from high school to the Naval Air Corps, and he spent about 1.5 or 2 years out on the West Coast patrolling for enemy subs off the coast. And then after the war ended, he stayed out there. He went to Pasadena City College, which was the same place that Jackie Robinson spent a little time. They didn't cross paths, of course. Jackie Robinson was there about 8 years earlier. But he was going to school there basically to go to school. He had no plans to play baseball professionally. He was taking classes, working at a grocery store. He pitched one exhibition game, threw a 3-hitter in the exhibition game, excuse me, and then he walked away. He had no desire to play collegiately. He said, I'm working from 8 to 4 at this grocery store. I'm going to night school. I've only got 90 minutes to myself during the day. I don't have time to play baseball. But he had a roommate. The roommate told him about a Giants tryout that was taking place in 1948, just in a nearby town in Monrovia, California. And during his time in the service, he had grown 3 inches. So he sprouted from 5'10" up to 6'1", 160 pounds. So suddenly he's sort of like has the physical build to be a major league pitcher. So he went to the tryout camp, and his fastball really wowed them. So he was signed by a Giant scout named Mickey Schrader. And his dad was okay with that. The only thing his dad was upset about is that he signed without a bonus. And his father said to him, like, do you not read the papers? Players get bonuses for signing contracts, but Al did not get a bonus like that. But he did get a professional contract. So later that year, he was assigned to the Giants Class C team in Reno, Nevada. And he got paid $25 a month to pitch. And he also, by the way, drove the team bus. And he was an outstanding pitcher for Reno. He went 26-9. He led the league in wins in 1948. He was a side armor, and he threw really hard, almost 1 strikeout an inning, but also a little bit wild, as often is the case with hard-throwing young pitchers. So he walked about 5 batters an inning, too. And one of the problems that he talked about at Reno is they never taught him anything. All he had was a fastball, and the best the manager could tell him was go out there and throw the fastball and strike everybody out. So he didn't learn much in Reno, and he never really did come up with much of a breaking ball or a changeup at all. I mean, throughout his career, he relied very heavily on the fastball. Nonetheless, he kept on moving up. So in 1949, his second year pitching professionally, he went up to Class B in Trenton in the Giants chain. Went up to Class A the next year in Jacksonville, 1950. Didn't pitch especially well in Jacksonville, but nonetheless got promoted again to Ottawa in the International League in 1951. Didn't really pitch very well there either, at least at first, because he was pitching out of the bullpen at first. And then partway through the year, they moved him into the rotation, and that proved to be excellent timing for him. because the Giants needed some pitching help at around that time in 1951. And they happened to play, the Major League team happened to be in Ottawa for an exhibition game. And Leo DeRocher asked his pitching coach, this guy, Frank Schellenbach, to hang around. And he had never seen Corwin pitch before, but he happened to be in town when Corwin pitched a game against the Montreal Royals, and he pitched well. He impressed Schellenbach with his performance, also impressed him in a conversation after the game, and Schellenbach recommended him for promotion. There were others in the organization who weren't really sure because Corwin's record was only 2-4 at the time, and there were others in the organization, other pitchers in the minor leagues who actually had major league experience. But Schellenbach said, look, this guy's got a great fastball. He doesn't have much else, but we think he can at least get through the league a couple of times before they figure him out. And that was kind of true. So Corwin gets called up on July 18th, which in itself was kind of a saga. So his plane didn't land until 1 a.m. The airline lost his bag. He gets to the Polo Grounds, and he had, skinny guy. So his waist was size 31, and there were no pants that fit him. But one of the things that he remembered about that experience was meeting DeRocher for the first time. And he said that DeRocher had this scent of Fabergé cologne that he never forgot. And to him, that scent of DeRocher's Fabergé cologne sort of symbolized New York and the big time and all of that. So it's just funny how those sensory memories kind of stick with you. And that was also the day he arrived was also the day that DeRocher revealed that he had an electrician rig up that device that would let the Giants steal signs. So Joshua Prager, who I spoke with, who wrote the book Echoing Green, said that, Corwin arrives in all this chaos, but he had a personality where he just sort of rolled with it. He was a very different person than DeRocher, but he was amused by DeRocher's, cursing and big personality and the stealing of signs and all that stuff. So Corwin makes his debut July 25th against the Pirates in 1951. He pitched well for a while. He only allowed 3 hits through 6 innings. But then in the 7th, he kind of ran out of gas. Joe Garagiola hit a 3-run homer off him, and he ended up with a no decision. A few days later, though, he shut out the Cubs on 7 hits on August the 1st. Then he had a complete game over the Phillies on the 12th, beat the Phillies again a week later, pitching really well in relief, had a complete game win over the Cubs on August 27th. He played a really big role for the Giants that August as they cut into that big Dodger lead. In the month of August, he had 5 starts, 4 relief outings. He went 5-0, ERA 2.27. And he had this demeanor that seemed to rub off on people, even though he was a rookie. He was cool and calm, and nothing really got to him. And there were reporters who said that kind of rubbed off on other people. He did not pitch much in December. So he had a game early in the month where he got hit pretty hard in the month of December on the 3rd. And that was pretty much it for him. DeRocher, the rest of the way, leaned really heavily on his veterans, Sal Magley, Larry Jansen, Jim Hearn. And Corwin got in a few games pitching mop-up relief 3 more times the rest of the regular season, but that was about it. He also had a mop-up appearance in the World Series that year in Game 5. He came in with the bases loaded and 1 out in the 7th with the Giants down 10-1. He gave up a 2-run double to DiMaggio, but then pitched a 1-2-3 8th inning. After the season, after that rookie 51 season, pretty eventful. His father died from complications from stomach surgery just days after the World Series. And he also got married to his wife, Patricia, that offseason. So that's Al and Patricia on the right side, Bobby Thompson and his new bride there on the left side. 1952, Corwin was assigned to Minneapolis to start the season, and he was pitching in this place called Nicollet Park. That, as you can see here, was really small. The right field fence was 279 feet. And he got kind of messed up with his mechanics because he was just obsessed with trying to keep hitters not hitting the ball toward that wall. And his wildness really came back to bite him in 1952. But he did get called up to the Giants again in August of 52. And he pitched really well. He went 6-1. But he somehow, for unknown reasons, kind of ended up in DeRocher's doghouse. DeRocher wasn't real patient with pitchers as it was, as you know. he really didn't like Corwin. As I wrote in the book, he and Corwin had about as much in common as a sewing machine and a tomato. They're completely different personalities. DeRocher was always on him, like, why can't you come up with a good changeup? He said, you have to rest the guy 2 days after he pitches in relief, even though that right after he got called up, he pitched Corwin 6 times in 7 days. So I'm not really sure where that came from. But DeRocher always seemed to have a bone to pick with Corwin a little bit. But he did spend all of 1953 in the majors, did not pitch particularly well, but he did have a home run off Ross Meyer of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was a really good hitter in the minor leagues. DeRocher used him a lot of times as a pinch runner too. So he was quite an athlete. However, by 54, his shoulder started going bad. And as he said, back in those days, there really wasn't a whole lot that could be done surgically. So you just kind of shut your mouth and pitched and hoped it got better and nobody noticed. And he spent the next 2 years bouncing back and forth between Minneapolis and the Giants. In 1954, he was a starter in Minneapolis and a reliever with the Giants. He was on the World Series roster in 54, but did not make an appearance that season in that World Series. By 55, DeRocher was really frustrated with him, and he spoke about that publicly in the papers. He said, well, Corwin, there's always something wrong with him. Well, there was. His shoulder was going bad, but nobody cared or nobody talked about that. So Corwin, again, bouncing back and forth between New York and Minneapolis, did not pitch well in Minneapolis. Pitched okay in 13 games in relief for the Giants, but mostly a mop-up guy, and that really wasn't a very competitive club that year. He did undergo shoulder surgery that offseason in the spring of 1956, and he was never the same, and he never made it back to the major leagues. So the Giants gave up on him. And then he spent a few years bouncing around with the Orioles chain, the Tigers chain, the Athletic chain, and he finally retired at the age of 33 after the 1960 season. His final major league record was 18-10, and his final major league ERA was 3.98, which was a little bit above average. As with many athletes, it took him a little while to adjust to life after sports. He didn't necessarily regret quitting. I talked to his wife, and she said he wasn't that kind of guy. He never didn't regret things, but he had to get out of Newburgh, New York, because he went back there. He was working for his father-in-law's company for a while, and everybody kept coming up to him saying, "Oh boy, you would have had a great career if you wouldn't have hurt your arm." And he was like, "I can't deal with these sob stories anymore. I got to get out of here." So he went to Southern California, about as far away as you can go. Got a job as a sales rep for Seagram's, which was sort of the stereotypical former athlete job. But that really wasn't his scene. He wasn't much of a drinker. And, he had to sit around in bars all night talking about the good old days. And he was a nice guy, but that just didn't fit his temperament very well. So he went into sales with Moen, the faucet company, and he found his niche there. He was extremely successful as a salesman for Moen. He was an amiable guy. He'd take his clients out to play golf. They'd talk about baseball out on the golf course. And Moen transferred him to Chicago in 1969. And there, Corwin was in charge of sales for 11 states throughout the Midwest. And his reputation sort of built. And a company called Grohe, which was based in Germany, hired him in 1977 to lead their U.S. operations. At the time, high-end faucets weren't really a thing. I mean, there were some people who had them in their homes, at least not in the US. I mean, there were some people who had really nice stuff, like, Elvis probably had, awesome faucets. But the average person kind of didn't. And Grohe and Corwin kind of led the way in making high-end faucets a thing. And there was an industry publication in 2004 that listed the industry's top innovators of the previous 50 years. And there were a lot of familiar names on the list. So Albert Moen, Herbert Kohler, Roy Jacuzzi, they were on that list. Al Corwin was on that list too. So in his field, he was really a pioneer. And I interviewed for the book his successor at Grohe, a guy named Bob Atkins. And Bob talked about how this job was tough. The German bosses were just abusive. They'd scream and yell at him, always pushing for more sales, more sales. And it was Corwin's job to sort of put on the happy face and come back to his salespeople and say, "Hey, everybody loves us. Don't worry about it." So his calm, cool nature that he developed on the that he showed on the baseball field, that sort of translated well into his business career. And people at Growy loved him. So he was the boss. He ran things, but he would like have a brown bag lunch and sit down on the loading dock or in the employee cafeteria. And he would talk to people. He had set up some great perks, a great pension plan. He was kind of an imposing figure there, always well dressed, and he had a big booming voice, and he had his giant 1956 World Series ring. But he was a down to earth guy. And Atkins talks about he never talked about baseball really, but everybody sort of knew he was a baseball player. And he said once somebody talked him into throwing a baseball at a company picnic, and he darn near took somebody's hand off. Even at advanced age, he could still put a little bit on his throws. At his retirement party, they gave him a baseball card, and on one side it said, one side there was a picture of George Washington, and on the other side was a picture of Corwin in his baseball uniform that said "Our Founding Father." So it kind of says something about how much people liked him. He retired in 1996, and they asked him to come back to attend sales meetings, which he did for a few years just because people wanted to see him. He split time between his home in the Chicago area and also a home in West Palm Beach. And Atkins said his home in the Chicago area was just incredible, beautiful, impressive. Played a lot of tennis, did a lot of fundraising, especially for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Didn't stay in touch with his ex-teammates, really. Wasn't the kind of person who looked back at things, so he didn't save a lot of memorabilia or anything like that. But there was a reunion of the 1951 team in San Francisco in 2002. And he did attend that and reestablish some of those connections. He was in real good health up till the early 2000s when they discovered a growth on his right shoulder. And it was malignant, unfortunately, and that had already spread to his lymph nodes. So they got it too late. And his wife said he had really fair skin. And as a kid, he'd spend a lot of time running around shirtless. So that probably kind of maybe got the ball rolling on the skin cancer that eventually ended his life. So he was really active, though, she said, up until the last couple of months. And his wife said that, physically he was hanging in there, but just the isolation in those last couple of months was the worst because he couldn't get out. And he was just naturally kind of a people person who loved being around people. He died on October 23rd, 2003. And he was survived by a wife, a son, a daughter, some grandchildren. So he was 76 years old at the time of his death. So that's the story of Al Corwin, a really interesting guy who not only had some success on the pitching mound, but what fascinated me most about him was that brilliant success he had in his career afterward. He was a very intelligent guy and was able to translate a lot of those leadership skills over to the business world.
James, that was a fabulous job, really.
Thank you.
Very interesting on both ends, from your Candlestick Park forthcoming book until this book again is available to all Saber members. You can download this. I have it downloaded, but this is my paper copy. It's also available for publication, for purchasing, on Amazon. So, James, I'll start it off. Quick question. We've had a lot of authors from this book, and I usually ask the same question. Were you assigned Corwin, or did you choose him?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So I think it was Bill Nowlin who's with Saber will periodically send out a missive like, "Hey, we have this book we're working on. Anyone want to contribute?" So I said yes because I like to write, and he sent a list of names. And the first guy I asked for, I think, was Sal Evars, because I was always fascinated with his name, which is a stupid reason for wanting to write about somebody, but there you go. Evars was taken, but Corwin was still on the list. And I remembered when I was a kid, I got his, I don't know if anybody remembers, this TCMA created these baseball cards, retro baseball cards. And I got his baseball card as a kid. And I was like, who's this guy? He's sort of a skinny looking pale guy. but he turned out to be a pretty good pitcher. So I'm like, Corwin, I'll see what I can make of him. And I had no idea. Yeah, there you go. Somebody's holding up the card there. I had no idea about his post baseball life. So I went into it wanting to write it just about, who's Al Corwin, the baseball player. But it was, I think, in some ways, the more interesting part of his life was his post baseball career.
Really, very interesting. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Sure.
Let's start off with Steve. Steve, you're up.
Gee, a great presentation. I had a couple of questions. You basically answered the one under Rocha. Yeah, TCMA, I was looking for the Corwin card today, and you're right. He was part of that black and white collectible from TCMA. Most of us don't know what you talked about, how some of these athletes do well after their playing days. One of the first speakers that I had with my group here in Arizona was Fred Cox, who was the kicker for the Vikings. But he made money because he was one of the founders of the Nerf football. Did you know that?
I don't know why I just read about this, but I just read about this like 2 months ago. I don't know how or why, but it's funny that you mentioned that.
Well, and your presentation was wonderful. My question was early on when you did the Candlestick Park, do you have because we've been tossing around this picture. I know Norm did some research, the groundbreaking photo of Candlestick. Are you in possession of that? And if you are, do you know the names of the characters in that picture? Other than the mayor, you don't have the photo?
I don't have the photo. I might have seen it in passing, but I haven't. I haven't gotten to the point where I'm collecting photos for the book yet. I'm going to do that probably this summer. So I might have seen it. I might have seen it.
Find that one.
Okay.
You have the ability to find out the personalities. That would be great because I know we tried. Norm, you got a couple of them right, Norm, but I think we're still missing a few. Obviously, Christopher, we figured out. I didn't realize
George Kelly is in the picture.
What is
Who
that?
is that?
George Kelly.
Oh,
the
George
first
Kelly,
baseman?
the player? Was he a
Yes.
player?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you
Yeah.
for the presentation, and I'm looking forward to that book.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. And if I come across that photo and I'm able to identify anybody in it, I'll
Send us a
let
Gary.
Gary know.
By
Yeah.
the way, most of those people you mentioned, Gary's been doing this. It seems like 25 years, Gary, but it's only like 3.5. I mean, Jenkins, Gallagher, 90% of the people, Prager that you mentioned have Zoomed with this group.
Oh, is that? I knew Will Clark had.
Clark, I forgot about him. Yeah.
Yeah. Because
Thank you.
I talked to him for a little bit too, and we had a nice little Q&A that came out of that.
Thank you.
I will send the photo to Gary to send to you.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
There you go.
We had Carl Erskine.
Mars,
is
you're
that right?
up. Thank you, Steve. Mars, you're up.
Well, thank you, James, for joining us. I
Thank
have I have 2 yearbooks originals. The 51 yearbook, which has Willie Mays' Trenton records, and the 55 yearbook, I believe, is the Simon and Schuster stamp book that I got at school for 25 cents, and one of the stamps is Al Corwin in color.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then I wanted to mention that in 1989, the Earthquake series, in that summer, they started doing some retrofitting at Candlestick. And we were sitting right below the VIP glass booth for that third game of the World Series. And there was an anchor bolt around center field that joined together the upper grandstand for the football, edition, the seats for football. And that fell into the parking lot. Luckily, it just missed somebody, right?
Wow.
And the last thing I wanted to mention is a bit of a trivia question. I had seen this movie years ago, but last year on Turner Classic Movies, hosted by Eddie Muller for the Film Noir every Saturday night, they showed Experiment in Terror. And Eddie Muller gave in the beginning of, before the film aired, he gave the audience a trivia question. He said, see if you know who the psychopath was. So in the middle of the movie, there's a profile of the psychopath, and I recognize him from Wild Side West. So my trivia question to you and the rest of our brethren is, Can anybody name who the psychopath was portrayed by in Experiment in Terror?
Ross Martin, I think.
Correct. Correct. Eddie
that?
Muller, Ross Martin.
I would have
Well,
said Don. I would have said Don Drysdale because they had snippets of him in it, and to me, he was the real villain in the story.
Well, yeah, because he's several players are in there, but Willie Mays is not. I think Cepeda won the game in extra innings with a home run. I think McCovey tied the game. This is what Eddie Muller said after the movie. McCovey tied, because he's from San Francisco. He said McCovey tied the game with a home run in the bottom of the ninth, and Cepeda won it in extra innings with a home run. But the trivia question was Ross Martin, which Eddie Muller disclosed at the end of the film. But I recognized him just by a side profile in a scene in the hotel room, and was so one of our members also knew that answer. I wonder how many others knew that.
Well, Dan Vandemortel, who's I'm not sure if he's still here or in a spot where he can talk. He in the chapter he wrote, he sort of talked about how they cobbled together different scenes from different games to give the illusion of a single game being played.
Right. I was going to say that if you watch the movie carefully and you really couldn't blink or else you'd miss it, Willie Mays actually is in the movie because he's in the on deck circle when there's a home run that's hit. So you'd have to know the number, the uniform number. You'd have to be watching for it, but he is there. But basically, I think they pretty much cobble it together they filmed it on a Friday night game in August. And then they had 2 or 3 people who were filmed probably in Los Angeles to do kind of like studio headshot type things. And then somehow there's a game in September where footage was obtained from that game. I don't know if the film crew returned back to film it or they got it from the Giants or the Dodgers, but pretty much from those 3 sources, that's how they compiled it together.
You remember the fan that was spilling beer on Lee Remick in the stands?
That wasn't Willie Mays.
Well, I know.
Thank you, Mars.
Thank you, James.
Harvey Weinberg, you are up.
James, that was a wonderful presentation. Well spoken, well organized, and very interesting.
Thank you.
That said, I'm going to throw something at you. I was in law school when Melvin Belli appeared in an episode of Star Trek.
Remember that?
I sort of remember seeing that in reruns. Yeah.
And if anything, Melvin Belli, I had not watched Star Trek, which had been on. This is the original Star Trek. It was the mid '60s, and I was not a Star Trekker at the time. I know I didn't go to any of those conventions, and I never dressed up as a Klingon or anything like that. But Belli was a prominent attorney, and I said, well, what's he doing in Star Trek? So I tuned into that episode, and it got me hooked on Star Trek. That's my only contribution to the discussion here. And you piqued my memory, or you tweaked my memory when you mentioned that he sued because the heated seats weren't.
Yeah, he was a character.
Oh yeah,
Dan wrote about that too. But that's a funny chapter. Just all the sort of legal back and forth.
If you Google Belli, and Google, Google gets you anything.
Sure.
Google Belli and Star Trek, it actually brings back memory. I did that when you first did it. I Googled it on my iPhone.
Yeah.
And he played the Good Angel or something like that.
I was going to ask, what did he play? Was he like a lawyer or playing
No. He was in one episode, and he played what was known as the Good Angel. I don't remember. I have to refresh my memory. I mean, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. No, I remember. I remember reading about it, and I love the old Star Trek, but I can't I wouldn't have known it was him when I was watching it because I didn't know
But
who he was at that
he
time.
was promoted. They promoted the idea that Melvin Belli is going to appear in Star Trek, and that's what got me to watch it.
Huh, that's
It's a
cool.
bunch of kids to try to take over the Enterprise, and one of the kids is actually his son in real life. His son was like 6 or 7 years old.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, was that the hippie kids that they had?
No.
no. Let's not get off our Giants. We still talk the Giants. I don't want to drift it into Star Trek, but
Thank
it's
you, Barbie.
Why wasn't Willie Mays ever on Star Trek?
what?
I said, why wasn't Willie Mays ever on Star Trek?
And by the way, you talked about somebody talked about Willie in the on deck circle.
Yeah, an experiment in terror, I guess.
Well, Willie was in the on deck circle for the most famous home run in baseball history.
There you
He
go.
was.
Yeah.
All right, Paul Ellis Graham, you are up.
Oh, thank you, Gary. James, thank you so much. I
Thank
didn't
you.
know a lot about Al Corwin. Where is he buried?
I believe he is buried in, that's a good question. I think the memorial service was in Geneva, Illinois. I think he is buried there, although I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that question. I'm like in real time here, I'm looking up on Baseball Reference because sometimes they have that information. Yeah, he's buried in River Hills Memorial Park Cemetery in Batavia, Illinois.
Oh, okay. The reason I ask is because I live 7 miles north of Newburgh. So I was just
okay.
sure. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Marlboro, New York. You rock. Ken Hogarty, you are up.
Thank you. A few things, I'll digress a little bit, but first of all, it was interesting a couple of weeks ago when people were talking about, and all you folks were talking about visiting the polo grounds. And when I was writing a chapter for James, but also I was just finishing something recently about something else about Kezar Stadium in San Francisco where the 49ers played and before they moved to Candlestick. I was wondering, 50, 60 years, you people were all going out to visit the polo grounds. I wonder how many people visit Candlestick even in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, the site where Candlestick was. I can't imagine there'll be a crowd like you folks doing that in 60 years at Candlestick. But
Only if they get lost.
yeah. Speaking of which, I was writing this story about Kezar and about the USF football team in 1951. And they did play a game in the Polo Grounds, actually, in 1951. Great team, undefeated, untied, uninvited, because they were a great team. They had 5 people that eventually were in the NFL Hall of Fame, including Pete Rozelle, who was their flack. And Ollie Matson was a great star, Bob St. Clair, Gino Marchetti. But they were invited to the Orange Bowl, but they refused to go because the Orange Bowl told them they couldn't bring their 2 African-American players.
Huh.
And it was quite a story, a great story that more people should know about. The reason I'm mentioning that, though, in connection with us, is that it's kind of interesting because over the years, Kezar was a great stadium for football. I can remember my early years, I'm sure Larry does too, and a lot of other folks going to games, the Y.A. Tittle, R.C. Owens, all those great memories and things like that. And they moved to Candlestick, and that's sort of, in a sense, I think the enclosure of Candlestick and everything wasn't great for that. But be that as it may, some great football memories there. But at Kezar, it was sort of really decrepit, and it was just falling apart. It had been donated to the city in 1926, East-West games all the years, many great things, the first ever NFC championship game in 1971, but it was completely deteriorating. Our high school was playing there, and I was a PA announcer watching the building crumble around me. But the great story is that when they finally demolished it, the city had originally gotten a property from the Kezar family, and it was for the youth of San Francisco. So in its place, they built a beautiful little 10,000 seat stadium that's still used for high school football, all kinds of other activities and things for youth. It's just a gorgeous little thing at the beginning of Golden Gate Park where the 60,000 seat stadium used to stand. And the thing that's kind of really neat about that is when they tore down Candlestick, they took out some of the seats and they put them into Kezar. So in a sense, Candlestick gave its life, and sort of like a patient donating something on his deathbed, it donated something that's still alive in San Francisco that I probably have sat in one of those seats at one of the, going back to my high school game, going back, I was a principal there, going back to watch games and things like that. So it's always kind of a neat thing to think that, you know, even in dying, it sort of gave life to something else, the old girl. So
Yeah, no, that's cool. I've
I've
seen photos of the new Kezar, and I didn't know the story, but I was like, wow, this looks very different than an old time football stadium. So that's kind of
I
cool to
wish they
hear
could
that,
do
Ken.
something like that at Candlestick and make it useful. I remember
Yeah.
when they tore down Seal Stadium and the white front went up, it was like sort of an aberration. It's like, no, the neighborhood shouldn't do that. It should, but I guess they finally got it right with the ballpark they finally built.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Hogarty, you left out you, the King McElhenney.
Yes, those are the great years, great teams, the $1 million backfield with Joe Perry and McElhaney and Tittle and them. So,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ken. Howard Manis, you were up.
Hi, James. I just have a couple of comments, one on each topic of tonight. Corwin and I actually have something in common. Back in 2008 or 9, I went to work for a German company as their East Coast USA representative. And it was a little bit different than Corwin because I was a company of one, basically, working out of my house years before the pandemic. And I had to conduct sales for that German company for covering the whole East Coast of the United States, basically. And it was a unmitigated disaster. You know, the language barrier was just awful. These guys barely spoke any English, and I didn't speak German. The time zone difference, it wasn't easy. And I had no other coworkers to really turn to. I had some American colleagues in other parts of the U.S., but it was a disaster. But just listening to you talk about Corwin and with this German company and how successful, my company, by the way, was an online company. It was all online, called Glass on Web. And I was selling things like, it was a sales job selling like auto glass and glass for windows and whatever. And everything was done online. You know, I had to learn the lingo of online advertising. I was a print guy. I worked for Chicago Sun-Times print and the New York Post print, and I also rep the Dallas Morning News. But that was tough working for a German company. So Corwin, you know, my hat off to him for, you know, posthumously for doing such a great job for them. The other comment has to do with my candlestick, and really it has to do with my bucket list. When I was a young guy, starting out young, I compiled a bucket list. My first thing was to go to Dallas and Dealey Plaza to see where Kennedy was shot. Second thing was going to Candlestick, because even though I was a New Yorker, I was a Giant fan because my whole family had been New York fans and then San Francisco fans. I finally got out to Candlestick. I didn't get to Dallas yet. I still haven't been to Dallas. I've been to Houston. That's the closest I've gotten on a business trip. But I got to Candlestick, and it was an August night game, and I froze my ass off. And more importantly, my girlfriend at the time, and by the way, I never married her because she was pretty angry with me after that night. Yeah, she froze everything off. And I begged her, we're going to go to a night game at Candlestick Park. You got to take a winter coat. She said to me, it's August. I am not dressing like it's February. It was cold. It was really cold. And she didn't speak to me for about a week after that. But what I remember about the game was this was 1982. And I guess the Giants must have been bad that year. And the place was virtually deserted. It was a midweek night game, maybe 10,000 people, mostly in the lowest stands. And they played the Pirates. I remember the Pirates in those bright gold uniforms that they wore, and those yellow, not really gold. But it was as depressing as going to a Met game in the mid-'60s. I'm a Met fan now. And, the Mets, they had people loyalists. They could lose 120 games, as they once did. But the Giants, they must have been turned off, I would guess, the fans, because the team had such success, in the 60s with Mays McCovey and, that whole Davenport and that whole gang, Tom Haller. I remember them like it was yesterday. I hardly knew any of the players. I think Robinson might have been the manager, Frank Robinson might have been managing them.
Yeah,
by 82. But it was depressing. The ballpark was dead. It was cold. The cold air kept balls from going out of the park. I think balls barely got out of the infield fly balls. It was windy, of course. So it was a pretty tough night at Candlestick. But at least one thing on my bucket list has been accomplished. Still got to get to Dallas. And now that I'm retired, my bucket list has grown by 100 times. And hopefully I'll live long enough to see most of those things. So thanks for your presentation tonight. I really enjoyed it because I really didn't know much about Corwin. You hear about Thompson and Willie and Jansen and all the great New York Giants 51. Corwin was just one of those guys that I knew nothing about. So thanks for educating me a little bit.
No, thanks, Howard. Yeah, his successor, Bob Atkins, who I mentioned, he talked about how, Corwin, people had no idea how much Corwin kind of shielded people from the pressure from Germany. So he became really a mentor for Atkins and helped Atkins become successful in that position as well. So he was a tremendous leader.
And by the way, one last thing about the German company, the reason I finally did leave it, I wasn't getting paid promptly. I'd sit there like 5 weeks after making a sale, and where was my commission? And they said, a lot of red tape, blah, 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 blah. Screw them. To me, they lost World War II to us. I could drop them and just not feel guilty about it.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Larry Simi, you had your hand up. I don't know if you still want to ask your question.
Yeah, it's actually more comment, Gary. And Jim, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Fabulous presentation. I want to mention, though, a little conversation I had with a boyhood friend of mine. His name is Kevin Eagleson. He actually was a very good basketball player at Santa Clara University. His dad was the engineer who developed the heating system at Candlestick.
Oh.
He claimed till the day he died that he had told them that they needed a 12 to 16-hour warm-up. Run the hot water through so it would have enough time to get up through the concrete, and that they turned it on only several hours before the game, and that they never turned it on again. I have no idea if that's true, but till the day he died, he claimed that was the case.
I think in Dan's chapter, I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but there's something in the chapter that echoes what you just said. So I think there's at least a kernel of truth in that, if not a real big kernel of truth in that.
All right, we'll go to Super Bowl award-winning Great Daner. Dan, you're up.
That's quite the introduction. Thank you. James, it's actually really nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
We've emailed, we've talked, but like we really do exist.
Exactly.
Yes. So I woke up today not knowing anything about Al Corwin, and now I know a lot, and I'm grateful for that. I think you could probably take any team in Giants history, and there's always the tweeners that have sometimes the most fascinating biographies, because they're not really good enough to stick around, but they're not so horrible, but they can't get there, and they're just kind of always in flux. You mentioned that you interviewed his wife, and I wondered if she was the source of the two things you mentioned, where he got in DeRocher's doghouse, and then his post-career fights with the German management. And I kind of wonder if you could bring him back, like to say, which was more difficult for you to deal with, Leo DeRocher or the German management? I bet you Leo DeRocher would win that prize.
That's a good point. He probably learned a lot about dealing with difficult people by dealing with DeRocher. Actually, his wife was not the source of either of those things. A lot of the details about his career at Grohe and the clashes with management in Germany, that came from Bob Atkins, who was his successor. And then the stuff with DeRocher was it was all over the press. I think in those days, players and managers were a little bit more free to be critical when talking to newspaper reporters. So it was like DeRocher criticized people quite openly and publicly. So most of that talk was really in the newspapers at the time, believe it or not.
It's sad in those times too, if you did get stuck in that kind of situation, there was very little you could do about it because of the reserve clause. You're pretty much stuck with it.
Yep.
Can't just leave the team, go free agent.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, young Joker. Norm Coleman, you are up.
First of all, I want to thank you for presentation. Both the things you said about Candlestick, I knew. The things you said about Al Corwin, I knew nothing. And I enjoyed both parts of it.
Good, thank you.
But the only thing I wanted to add about the heating system at Candlestick is I can testify they had one. So when I was a kid, at a very cold night game, I dropped something on the ground and I bent down to pick it up and my hand touched the ground and the ground was warm. The heating system did not work in terms of heating us up, but the thing was turned on and it was warm. And so
Huh.
just so you know, the thing was there and it just didn't work. And that's all I've got. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, Norm.
Steve, go ahead.
You know, there's not enough said about Leo DeRocha. In fact, his son Chris, we become phone friends. He was actually in Arizona once years ago. Just spoke to him the other day. I still say if DeRocha was not suspended in 1947, a lot of what happened to Robinson would not have happened. Just my opinion. Mr. Hogarty, I don't think I've ever met you. You said you were a principal. Is he still?
Yes, he's there.
Yes, I was principal at Sacred Heart Cathedral in San Francisco.
Okay, was that anywhere near the Richmond School District?
Not too far. We're near Civic Center. Sacred Heart Cathedral is
The reason I'm asking,
right near City Hall. So Richmond,
Gary and I
a
connected.
lot of the kids came from the Richmond.
Did you succeed John Scudder?
Yes, I succeeded John Scudder.
Because his daughter went to Sacred Heart when John Scudder and his two daughters were attending.
Yeah.
Gary and I connected a number of years ago. At that time, she was a promotion manager for the Giants, Allison Vidal. And we met her in Cooperstown, and her dad was a principal in the Richmond School District. Vidal, V-I-D-A-L. Not sure if that name rings a bell.
Oh, I thought you meant the Richmond district, but you're talking about Richmond in the East Bay, I assume.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, they were in the East Bay. Nowhere near you?
Not too far from where I live, but
Okay.
not.
Name
not
doesn't
Richmond.
ring a bell?
No.
Norm, do you remember that gal from the Giants? Norm, is he still on?
Say the name again, Steve?
Allison Vidal.
No.
She was the one that came up with the sleep out at the ballpark.
Oh, okay.
You don't remember the name? Okay, not important. Thanks
And
again.
I thought my former student Mario Alioto was the one who came up with all the great promotions, like the first bobbleheads in Major League Baseball and stuff. But I guess there were some other things he needed help with. But
okay, thank you.
Did anybody have a question who did not ask one yet?
Just one, Gary. I just want to point out, I was amused by Howard's recounting of his one trip or his trip to Candlestick, where he had a cold, miserable night and no one there. I had one trip to Candlestick in 1978, Memorial Day weekend. It was packed. They had the biggest crowd in the major leagues that year. The weather was magnificent. I don't know what anyone was talking about it, what all the trouble with the stadium. It was just beautiful. Just a wonderful weekend. They were drawing 60,000 every game and played the Dodgers. They were in first place. It was just
Was that the Mike Ivy home run?
It was the Mike Ivy home run. I was there.
Oh, yeah.
And that was just a phenomenal day. Yes.
Yeah, we talk about the Mike Ivy home run. That season, 78 season, first of all, that was a good year. So
Noel Tabelli was our manager.
Yeah, they got a lot of support. And if you were there during the day, some of you know, Candlestick was actually a pretty pleasant place to be, but it was like around 3 or 4 when the wind started kicking in, and that's when it got pretty nasty. But
that Sunday was just phenomenal.
Yeah.
I was there on a beautiful day in 1962.
Yeah.
I know you have the recollections sent in by some of these members and others. All are from the aspect of being in the stadium. A lot of New Yorkers will tell you what they saw watching on television. And it was quite an adventure. I put some of that in a recent book I wrote, but there are some vivid memories of Candlestick Park that a person in New York would see especially at night games, on the local television. So just to let you know about that.
Yeah.
And also, I used to love watching the Dirty Harry movies because inevitably Clint Eastwood would have a giant cap on, or he'd be at Candlestick Park. And I believe the first one, he was in the stadium. So just great memories of that.
There's I don't know if there's going to be room for this in the book. I think there will be, but I'm planning to try to put together sort of as an addendum to Dan's article about Experiment in Terror, a list of all the movies and TV shows that were in which Candlestick played a role.
Streets of San Francisco, yeah, the TV
Streets
show.
of San Francisco,
Yeah.
an episode of Ironside.
Ironside, right,
Took place there. There's a bunch of movies. It was actually a pretty popular place to record shows and movies.
Hey, James, thank you so much for a great presentation on Al Corwin, and we're all looking forward to your new venture. So hopefully you'll keep us abreast of when that might be coming out and what's going on with it. But guys and gals, let's give it up to James Forr.
All right. Thank you very much. I will keep you posted, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight and hear all your questions and comments. It's been really enjoyable.
All right. Next week, we will meet again with Lou Friedman. If anybody wants to hang around and talk some Giant baseball, I'll leave the room open for a while. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.